Hello and welcome to Variation 39. Variation 39 is about Ricochet Arpeggios, and Ricochet Arpeggios are even more passive than Ricochet normally is. Ricochet is already our most passive bowing. We hardly control anything, we just give the impulses and the bow bounces on its own. In Ricochet Arpeggios, this is even more the case. We give the impulse and the bow bounces on its own. So it's even more passive than we have with normal ricochet. And if this is new to you, I would advise you to work through the variations 20, 25, 26, and 32. Those are the ricochet variations because I show you how to build up ricochet and you get used to the normal ricochet before you start on the Ricochet Arpeggios, because it's a good idea if you have a good grounding in ricochet before you start Ricochet Arpeggios. I have the links in the description for you. It's very important to master the left hand first, because with such a passive bowing as Ricochet Arpeggios, where we do not control the individual notes at all, it's very important that the left hand is easy for us, because the left hand has to follow the bow. We need to concentrate on the bow and we need to have the left hand able to follow the bow. The left hand has to move almost automatically. So give yourself the time to master the left hand first. It's quite common in Ricochet Arpeggios. The most famous example in repertoire is probably the end of the cadenza in the Mendelssohn concerto. And it's quite common to spend a lot more time practicing the left hand than practicing the bowing, because if the left hand isn't secure, then you have no chance with the bowing, because the left hand will get in the way of the flow of the ricochet. Practice these chords as double stops, slurring two double stops together. Most of my practicing time when I practice this variation is doing exactly that. Make sure you practice the connections between the chords, because when we play the Ricochet Arpeggio, the bow dictates the tempo. We have to take the tempo that the bow does this Ricochet Arpeggio, and it's a fast tempo, so we have to be able to get from one chord to the next easily and fluently and without a jerk, because any jerk will also get in the way of the Ricochet Arpeggio. Particularly when getting from one chord to the next requires a shift, one really has to spend some time securing that. For example, starting bar 9. I spend a lot of time just going from one to the next, backwards and forwards. One can spend a lot of time doing that, and the better you can do that, the better your Ricochet Arpeggios will be. I have a fingering suggestion for you. I'll start bar 10. The fingering suggestion is for bar 11 and 12 and 13. I'll start bar 10. And now I go into second position. Stay in second position. And now I go into third position. The reason for this is, first of all, I don't like playing fifths with my third finger, so if I can avoid it, I do. And by going to second position, I can play the fifths with the second finger, which is much better for playing fifths, certainly in my case. The other reason is that I have smaller shifts. I'm not going from first position into third position because that's a bigger shift. And with the ricochet being so sensitive, I prefer to move in smaller steps. So I go first position, second position, third position. So that's what got me to choose this fingering. Try it out, you might find it easier too. Another practicing method I use for securing the left hand, which is already moving me into the direction of where I want to go, is that I no longer slur 2 double stops, but I actually play triplets so I'm moving in the direction of where I want to go, but I don't play them like this. I play them with the string crossings as double stops, but I think as triplets. This I find quite helpful because this I then speed up bit by bit. I also would like to mention that when you speed this up, you have to add quite a lot of weight. So you have and speed that up further. The reason I do this in double stops is first of all to keep very close string crossings, and also for intonation. It's much better and easier to hear intonation in double stops than in single notes, and I can still speed it up a little bit. And notice one has to add quite a lot of weight. This is important because the reason we're adding weight is to stop the bow from bouncing. What we want later on is for the bow to bounce. So the more conscious we are about adding the weight in this practicing method, the easier it will be to take the weight away and let the bow bounce later on. Now, to practice the bowing, the best thing you can do is just to practice the bowing on one chord at first, because once you've mastered the bowing, then you can start doing it on several chords until you get through the whole variation. But to actually learn this bowing, it's a lot better if you do that just on one chord, because then you can completely concentrate on the bow and don't have to worry about your left hand. Start with playing it in triplets. Now, not with double stops, because we're actually going to need generous string crossings. So not in double stops, and also not in the lower half like we did the triplets in double stops, but in the upper half. Just do that. Notice how it's the arm doing the movement. And then speed that up. The arm movement stays the same. It just goes up and down. And notice as you speed up how you have to add quite a lot of weight. Be very conscious of that, because the reason we're adding the weight is to stop the bow from bouncing. We want the bow to bounce for the ricochet, but the more conscious we are about the adding of the weight, the more conscious we will be of taking weight away. Notice how as I speed up, I use less and less bow. It's only just about the string distance between D and E string, the bow that I use. So don't use too much bow. The next step is to do the same thing. You start slowly and you speed up, and this time you don't add the weight so that the bow can bounce. And then the bow starts bouncing eventually. It doesn't yet have to be clean 3, 3, 3, 3 bouncing. Just feel the bow starting to bounce. You'll feel a little bit of a loss of control. It's not very pleasant, but it's what we need because we're giving the control to the bow, because this is our most passive bowing. It doesn't matter if it's all over the place at first. Make sure that you don't tilt your bow. You want all the hairs and you want the bow stick directly above the hairs, because you want maximum tension on the hairs so that the bow bounces. If anything, you can even slightly have an inclination to tilting the bow direction bridge. Not completely, but just a little bit. If anything, you're moving a little bit in this direction. And that way you can increase the bouncing. Notice how as from a certain speed I'm giving an accent on the first one. I'm doing as from a certain speed. And that is the impulse we need for our ricochet. That's the impulse that we give on the bottom note, and the rest happens on its own. It doesn't matter if it's all over the place at this stage. You'll get it cleaner and clearer later on. So you have this accent always on the first one. With ricochet, every practicing session is an experiment, because one's always experimenting with how can I find the ricochet, what does my bow need? And that actually never really changes. One usually finds it sooner as one has more experience with this kind of bowing. But it's always an experimenting. I always experiment with, do I tilt my bow a little bit towards the bridge or don't I? How much bow do I use? Sometimes I do the ricochet and I'm not satisfied and I try using more bow and suddenly it's much better. Sometimes I do the ricochet and remember from the day before, oh, use more bow, and it doesn't work. I have to use less bow. So it seems to be different to a certain extent every day. Also, the string crossings have to be quite generous. So we're not trying to do close string crossings here. How generous is also always a matter of experimenting. And then of course ricochet is very different with every bow. That's another thing. So whatever works best for me and my bow might not be very helpful for you and your bow. So what you have to do, once you have got to this stage where the bow bounces, even if it's still a bit messy, you start experimenting. You start experimenting with how much bow. So you start, you speed up, and then you try to use more bow. And you find, okay, that might be better. Or you use less bow. And then you have to see whatever sounds better. And then experiment with the movement of your arm. More generous string crossings or not. avoid getting the G string, of course. That's too generous. So too generous is also not good because that doesn't help. And then experiment with keeping the string distance a little bit closer. Everything will be a personal mixture for you and your bow. So you experiment with your angle of bow stick, you experiment with how much bow you use, and you experiment with how generous you do the string crossings. You also have to experiment with the exact place of bow. It will be somewhere in the upper half because the bow is too heavy in the lower half. But there again, depending on your bow, it could be that it's closer to the middle. It could also be that it's better if you're further away from the middle, if you go closer to the tip. So you have to experiment with that as well. And you also have to experiment with weight to a certain extent. We have to take weight off of the bow stick for the bow to bounce. So our hand is leaning direction fourth finger, not as much as I'm showing, but you take weight off of the first finger of your right hand. But how much is again the question, because if I take weight away completely, it doesn't really work. So I need to have a bit of weight also to give this impulse. But if I put on too much weight, then it doesn't work because I'm squashing the ricochet. It won't bounce then. Then we don't get the bouncing. So you have to experiment a little bit with how much weight you put on the bow stick. Usually, remember with ricochet, adding weight makes it faster. So if you have ricochet just on one note without any weight, it's quite a slow bounce. If I add weight, it gets faster. So one does have to add a little bit of weight for this kind of ricochet arpeggio. So you see, there's many variables which we have to experiment with, and practicing these ricochet arpeggios is basically exactly that. You're experimenting with the different variables until you find it, and the next day you experiment again. Another thing which helps is to separate the down bow and the up bow ricochet. So you take a break in between. And then you gradually shorten the break until you get rid of the break completely. So that can help a lot as well, just to get a feeling for how much weight you need on the bow stick. I found that quite helpful. Once you've found the ricochet, stay on each chord for an indefinite amount of time and just switch to the next chord sometime, refining your ricochet. So you start slowly on the string, you increase the speed until the bow bounces, and once you have that, then you sometimes switch to the next chord. That gives you time, so you can completely concentrate on the ricochet, and when you feel, okay, now I can switch to the next chord, you just do that. And then you concentrate on your ricochet again, and sometime, whenever, it doesn't matter when, you want to switch to the next chord, you just switch to the next chord. That way you're actually already able to play this variation. Then the next step is to switch the chords sooner, is just a very small step. Then what I would do is I would say, okay, I'll switch it after 6 down and up bows. First, always start slowly and find it, and then start counting. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So you find your ricochet first, then you start counting, and then you switch after 6 down and up bows. The next step, of course, would be to switch after 4. One, two, three, 4. And then you switch after 3, and then you switch after 2, and then you have the variation. Like I mentioned, the biggest impulse we're giving is on the down bow. But we also give a small impulse on the up bow. That's why this practicing method is so helpful, because we give an impulse on the up bow as well. So when we do this in tempo, it actually helps to know that we also give a small impulse on the up bow. Not as big as the one on the down bow, but a little one. So that's important to know as well. Okay, I hope you find this useful. As always, of course, let me know if you have any questions, and happy practicing.